we're closer to the birth of Christ, and we are about to go in just a little bit into the prophets, which we'll move in a different way then. But we're here, and Israel has asked for a king, and so if you see in your Bible on page 309 down there under transition in a shaded part, it talks about a prophetic account, Saul and David. The Samuel and Kings were much different than the book of Chronicles. Now, these are historical books. These are not prophetical books. So they are historical books, and they come from different perspectives. And some say they're prophetic views. Samuel and Kings, while Chronicles is a priestly view. It's a priestly view. And if you read this a little bit, the prophetic account begins with prophet Samuel's meeting with Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, who had become the first king. We'll get to that in just a minute. This is a little bit of ahead of it. And then Saul's career is woven together with that of Israel's next king who rises to power, which is King David, who was named to be a king when he was a very young man, and then he had to grow up before he could take over. To make a long story short, and I think you all know this, after King David was king, Saul became jealous, and he became unhappy, and he tried to kill David so that David could not be king and he could be king. That went on, but not at first. At first, everybody was on the same page. They were all together. So we are here now in chapter 9, where it says Samuel anointed Saul. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish. And then it says Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. Isn't it interesting that the Bible describes him that way? As handsome a man as anywhere that could be found in Israel. And he was a head taller than anyone else. So what they're trying to tell us that he is an imposing figure. He's going to be king, and he is an imposing figure, a big figure. It says, now this is I think another fascinating detail when you study the Bible in the way we are. The donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost, and Kish said to his son Saul, take one of the servants with you and go and look for the donkeys. And that's how this all got started. Now the question is, we'll come to later, is why were the donkeys lost? We'll come to that in just a minute. They weren't really lost, is the answer. So he passed through the hill country of Ephraim and through the hill country around Shalisha. They did not find them. They went on into the district of Shalem, but the donkeys were not there. Then he passed through the territory of Benjamin. They did not find them. When they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, come, let's go back, or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and stop worrying about us. But the servant replied, look, in this town there's a man of God. He's highly respected, and everything he says comes true. Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us the way to take. Saul said to the servant, if we go, what can we give the man? The food in our sacks is gone. We have no gifts to take to the man. What do we have? The servant answered him and said, look, I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man so that the man of God, so that he will tell us what to take. And so, formerly in Israel, it says if they went someone to inquire of God, they would go to a seer, now called a prophet, seer, but they'd have to give them something. Good, Saul said to his servant, come, let's go. So they set out for the town where the man of God was. As they were going up the hill to the town, they met some young women coming out to draw water, and they asked, is the seer here? He is, they answered. He's ahead of you. Hurry now. He has just come to our town today, where the people have a sacrifice at the high place. As soon as you enter the town, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. Now, it says above there, right on that page, 310, evil high places. So there were some places that they thought of as evil, and these people were going to offer a sacrifice, and the seer, the prophet, was going to be there. And this would redeem the high place, is what they were trying to do, redeem the high place. As soon as you enter the town, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. People will not begin eating until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat, go Go up now, you should find him about this time. They went into the town, and as they were entering, there was Samuel coming toward them on his way to the high place. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord revealed this to Samuel. About this time tomorrow I will send you a man from land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people of Israel. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me. When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people. Saul approached Samuel at the gateway and asked, Would you please tell me where the seer's house is? I am the seer. Go ahead of me up to the high place, for today you are to eat with me, and in the morning I will send you on your way and will tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them. They have been found, and to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, not to you and to your whole family line. Saul answered, But I'm not a Benjamite, but am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? And Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the town and seated them at the head of those who were invited, about 30 in number. Samuel said to the cook, Bring the piece of meat I gave you, the one I told you to lay aside. So the cook took up the thigh which was on it and set it in front of Saul. Samuel said, Here is what has been kept for you. Eat, because it was set aside for you for this occasion, from the time I said I've invited guests. And Saul dined with Samuel that day. After they came down from the high place to the town, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof of his house. They rose about daybreak, and Samuel called to Saul on the roof, Get ready, and I will send you on your way. When Saul got ready, he and Samuel went out together. As they were going down to the edge of the town, Samuel said to Saul, Tell the servant to go on ahead of us. The servant did so. Would you stay here for a while so that I may give you a message from God? Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah, the border of Benjamin. They will say to you, The donkeys you set out to look for have been found, and now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you. He's asking, What shall I do about my son? Then you will go on from there until you reach the great tree of Tabor. 3 men going up to worship God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. After that, you will go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you will meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place with lyres, timbrels, pipes, and harps being played before them. They will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with it, and you will be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you. Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you're to do. So that was a lot, and he surprised Saul. Saul doesn't understand because comes from the least tribe. He doesn't understand why anything so great would be placed upon him. He doesn't understand why this seer is telling him all of this, why the meat is set aside. He just doesn't understand. But they are so used to hearing from people like seers, prophets, that they do what they say. They just sort of follow them. They know to do it. It was part of their lineage of how they did things. So now, as Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart. All these signs were fulfilled that day. When he and his servants arrived at Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him, and the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he joined them in their prophesying. When all those who had formerly known him saw him prophesying with the prophets, they asked each other, What is this that has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? Now, let's take just a second to talk about when they say they were prophesying. When they were prophesying, what does that mean? This is not something in our lineage here.
Foreseeing the future?
Foreseeing the future, but also talking to God, talking in tongues. They are doing something we don't do. They were talking in tongues. They called it prophesying. This is different from the kind of prophesying that we learn when we study the prophets Isaiah all those things. This is a little different. But they are prophesying, they're speaking with God, and they are talking in a different tongue than only God understands. These people don't understand what they're talking about. It's sort of like a secret language. And so they said, now Saul's uncle asked him and his servant, where have you been? Looking for the donkeys. But when we saw they were not to be found, we went to Samuel. Tell me what Samuel said to you. He assures us the donkeys had been found, but he did not tell his uncle what Samuel said about the kingship. Remember, he told him to wait 7 days? So Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now done what? Rejected your God, who saves you out of all your disasters and calamities. And as you have said, no, appoint a king over us. So now present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and clans. Here we go again. We've been through this so many times. Israel has now abandoned what God has told them. They don't think they need it. They think they're on their own. They think they're going to do well. And now they're in a mess. And they've called for God to appoint a king, as they have done many times, haven't they? They've asked for God to appoint a leader. So he's saying, present yourselves. So when Samuel had all Israel come forward by tribes, the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and Matri's clan was taken. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was taken. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he has hidden himself among the supplies. He didn't want to do it. It was too much. He didn't see it happening. And he was overwhelmed. They ran and brought him out. As he stood among the people, he was a head taller than any of the others. Samuel said to all the people, do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people. Then the people shouted, long live the king. Samuel explained to the people the rights and duties of kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Then Samuel dismissed the people to go to their own homes. Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. Some scoundrels said, how can this fellow save us? They despised him and brought him no gifts. But Saul kept silent. And then it goes on to talk about how Saul rescues the city of Jabesh. And then finally, Saul is confirmed as king. And there he says, the people then said to Samuel, who was it that asked Saul reign over us? And these men over us, we need to know them so we can put them to death. But Saul said, no one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel. He showed mercy. Saul showed mercy. And Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal and there renew the kingship. So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. If you notice, 2 or 3 times now I've read that they celebrated fellowship offerings. So they had different, remember that when we were going through all those tedious offerings, they had different offerings. And some were offerings to God, and some were fellowship offerings to God. That they would all be together, that they would all have fellowship together, fellowship offerings. And then in chapter 12, it's going to go into Samuel's farewell speech, and then it goes into. We'll go into this in detail, but what is going to happen is they're going to show that Saul was a great king. He was a great battle king. He was a great leader of the people of Israel into battle. But later, it says in chapter 15, the Lord rejects Saul as king because he didn't have the heart that God wanted him to have for it. And so he did some things that were not right. We'll get to them next week. I'm just trying to give you a little preview here. He rejects Saul as king. And so when that happens, if you look on page 320, I'm just skipping ahead, but I want you to understand what's going to happen. God rejects Saul as king, and then he gathers up David. And now in our Bible, that is the chronological Bible, they have inserted right here the 23rd Psalm on page 320. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. So they've moved that up to where David actually said it, which is a wonderful thing that we now know where that fits in. In the Psalms, it's just the 23rd Psalm. We know that. But here it puts it into contextual information about when this happened. And after this was done, David meets who? Goliath. You're right. He meets Goliath. And he saves the Israelites from who? The Philistines. So Saul was going to, but he didn't. He was a great leader of battle, but he didn't get that done. And so then now God moves up David. And before David is a young boy now. And we now know that David out in the field, imagine he's a shepherd. Out in the field, he says what we know as the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd. And in our version of it, in this Bible, it says, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right path for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So David had arrived in Saul's court as a musician and armor bearer, and then he's followed immediately by a second arrival as a boy slayer of the Philistine giant. And though these accounts are sort of puzzling, it tells sort of the progress that David made as a young boy to be in Saul's court. And then what happened was, when David killed Goliath, the people rallied around David and held him up, and it made Saul jealous. It made Saul jealous. And he didn't like it, and so now he goes after him. And so David goes into hiding. We'll talk about that in more detail. But David goes into hiding. And he hides from Saul until God deals with Saul, and David is able to take up being king of Israel. So I've skipped over a lot right there, but I'm doing it to say we're coming close to the time of King David. And when we get to King David, then we're gonna start going into Psalms. Will be part of 1 Samuel, and the Psalms. We'll start inserting Psalms now throughout these books of the Bible, and we'll stop at some point here pretty quickly after we get King David established. We'll stop and we'll go to Isaiah. So, but we need to get King David on the throne and get him established before we move forward. Yes, sir.
There's a great contrast between Saul and David.
Yes, what was it?
Saul is the humanistic side.
Yes.
Because God told Israel, I've given you the king you want.
Yes.
David is the spiritual side because he has a heart after God's own way.
Yes. And yes, that's very good. That's right. The other way to say that, excuse me, too many nights coming back from the hospital. I'm sorry. It was midnight last night almost. That's a very important part. The other thing is that while Saul started out in hiding and thought that he was not worthy, as you recall, as soon as he got the kingship, he became worthy in his own mind.
Ego.
Because he was a humanistic man, not a person that God chose. So he was a man of the people. So he became full of himself, and he won some battles, and he became even more and more. And the more that all went on, the more he strayed from God. David was humble, and he was a young boy. When he was chosen, he was very young. He didn't even have the kingship of Israel in his sights. He was young. And then he went out and he slew the giant, as it said in our Sunday school lessons when we were kids. And he didn't necessarily think anything about it. But we know that that boy with some rocks could have never hit Goliath if it had not been for what?
Vacant spot in the map.
Do what?
They're hitting between.
Yeah, but what caused that to happen the way it did?
God aimed his rock.
God aimed the stone,
Yeah.
the rock, to get to there. God aimed that. David couldn't have done that on his own, and David knew it. But he had the confidence that God was with him. He just said, "The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want." So he went forward and did it with God in his, with God as his right hand, and he was able to slew the giant. They say slew, S-L-E-W, slew the giant. But even then, David didn't think anything about being king. He just thought that he had served Saul and the people of Israel and God mostly. He had done what God had anointed him to do. But the people rose up in support of David after that. And he was, as he said, God's own man.
Also, at the end of Saul's life, he goes to a soothsayer to find out what is going to happen. He just completely turned away from God. And
well, he was afraid that once David took over, David would search him out and kill him. And we all know the story that David did search him out as king. He sent men to find him, and they found him. But he was an old man. He was sick, if you'll recall. And David had him brought back to his castle, to his, whatever they called it. And he gave him a place and took care of him until he died.
David had a couple of chances to kill him.
And didn't.
And Saul knew it.
Because Saul was anointed by God, and David was not going to go against
God's anointed.
But at the end of the time, he brought his enemy in to his palace, that's the word, and said, "You will eat at my table." Remember that? He said, "You will eat at my table." And I think, how many of us would do that? You know, not many. Not many of us. But that's the difference between God's anointed person and David. And Saul had to go down and hit bottom before he could do that. So that's the way that is. And it's an interesting story, and it's more interesting when you know the background that we know about how Saul came into power through Samuel, because the people of Israel demanded it, and then how it all went to pieces and how David picked up the pieces. And that's sort of how it all works. So we'll get a little more detail of all that next week. Read those chapters, and we'll go into a little bit about it, and then we'll move on. We'll get David in the throne, we'll get Saul at the table, and then we'll move on.
But God even chastises Samuel. He says, "What are you doing sitting around here? Go find David and
pick him out."
And he says, "Because I've rejected Saul." And
so Samuel goes to David's father and says, "I need to see your sons." And there were many sons. And he had, remember the story, he has them all come in, and he says, "No, none of these will do. Don't you have another son?" And his father says, "Well, yes, I've got David out. He's just a kid out in the fields with the lambs." He said, "Bring him to me." And he says, "You are the one." And he anoints him the king of Israel in front of his father and those brothers. And but he was little and he had to grow up before it was time to take over the kingship.
Well, one of the surprising things is that the brothers were not jealous and trying to take revenge on
As
David.
opposed to who?
One of them.
Joseph.
Joseph. Remember that Joseph's brothers threw him in the well and then sold him off? And then
Shall
they had
we
to
really
They had to go before him and get the food for their father and realize it was their brother, and he took care of them from then on. All of these stories, excuse me, all of these stories that we've read and are going to read here with David show one overriding quality to me. That is, all of these men of God showed what?
Mercy.
Grace. Mercy. Grace. I like the word grace. They showed grace. They had their hands on the throats of their people, and they didn't do it. They did that. So we're seeing the time when eventually Jesus comes and shows grace and mercy to all of the people,
Especially Peter.
especially Peter, who's in trouble today again, as we'll hear in the gospel.
I'm sorry.